Thanks, Erica. Good morning, everybody. We've got a nice small group here today. Might have something to do with the weather. So we'll try to make this as conversational as we can, and I'll encourage you to raise your hands if you've got questions or comments as I proceed through the slides. I'm looking at Wes to make sure that everything is okay. Everything is okay. All right, good. All right. So what we're going to talk about this morning is kind of public trust and confidence related. For sure, and I know that's the theme of the conference. We're here to think about this issue, to understand the dynamics that are in play, and obviously to figure out things that we might want to think about or do differently that will help us maintain and enhance public trust in our courts. And this is obviously sort of an abiding concern at the National Center for State Courts. Public trust is sort of underpins everything that we think about and that we do. And so I've been working on this issue for quite a while, and I've had the good fortune of being the lead on a project which is called the State of the State Courts, which is an annual public opinion survey that we administer, and we do it usually at the end of the year, November, December. We did do one in 2024. We ran it in December of 2024. And in these surveys, we are asking Americans to give us their views about how much trust they have in the courts. But probably just as important, trying to understand some of the underlying dynamics that are in play. Like, why do they feel the way that they feel? Numbers are great. They give us trends over time, but we also kind of want to know a little bit beneath that. What are the things that they might like to see done differently? So we've been doing these surveys for over 10 years now. And a couple months ago, I sort of decided that it would be fun to look at the trends over time, because we spend a lot of our focus on, okay, well, what do people think right now? What is the number right now? Which is good. But we also kind of like, what can we learn from everything that we've collected over this period of time? So I started looking at consistency in questions that we had asked, because a lot of the questions that we pose in these surveys are the same. Some that are different, but we try to keep some regularity in many of the questions. So we've got this sort of data set that goes back a number of years. And I went into the National Center's library and discovered that there are some historical surveys as well. And so I pulled those out, started going through those, and was really struck by the consistency in both the challenges that were defined, going back in time, and some of the responses that have been provided. So the surveys, the historical surveys, one goes back to 1977, which was the really first big one that NCSC did shortly after it was founded. And then there's another really big survey from 1999. So we have this data from the last 10 years, and then we have a survey from about 25 years ago, and then we've got a survey from nearly 50 years ago. And thus the title here, right? So we're going to look at nearly 50 years of public opinion, try to draw out some threads in what we see. And I'm going to sort of break this into both good and bad pieces, because looking at these surveys, we're able to see some positives in what people think about the work that we do. And there are a lot of challenges, and we're going to spend probably more of our time talking about the challenges. But I'm going to start by looking at some of the things that we see that should give us some hope, because there are positive elements. So before I begin, does anybody want to ask any questions about these surveys, or how they're put together, or should I jump straight in? Happy to take questions at any point. I know sometimes people are like, well, how'd you get there? So okay, great, we got a question.
Do you contract with a survey company that has this? Okay, who would that be?
Sure, yeah. So we do. We have used a company called GBAO Strategies for the last 10, 12 years. And if you are able to hang around for the final session today at 3 o'clock, the closing plenary, the pollster himself is coming to join us to talk about kind of a different topic, somewhat related topic. But we've been using this polling for really the entirety of the last 10 years. So there's consistency in the methodology that they use, and they certainly have adapted their methodology over time. But there's great benefit in having the same research team help you year after year after year. You can really build on it. But good question. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so let's get started. So I'm going to start with the positives, the good pieces that I was able to pull out through all this information, and talk through what these are and give you a little bit of detail. So the first finding that's on the positive side is that courts are the most trusted of the three branches of government. We are still in that category. That's been a thing that we have been, I think, sort of hanging our hats on for a long time. We're getting maybe a little too close for comfort in whether we're still viewed that way, but to date, over the last number of years, we're still seen in a more positive light than the legislative branch or the executive branch of government. The second key finding on the good side is that courts do have a critical role, that people see courts as protectors or guardians of individual rights. This really connects back to what I would describe as a core American value, right? And people see the courts as having a very important role in protecting individual rights, and they think that we do a good job at that. The third finding, which is more recent data, is that there is a growing comfort level with remote court appearances. And you'll see in the data, we're going to look back a couple of years and see how it's changed. We're going to take a look at how the pandemic impacted people's views on this. But there is a growing comfort with being able to do more of the maybe routine pieces of court business remotely rather than in person. So it is also setting an expectation that I think we need to be thinking about too. And then the fourth key finding on the good side is that procedural fairness is seen as something that we do very well. Anybody want to give me a definition of what procedural fairness is? I can take a stab at it, but I'd rather one of you court professionals told me what your perspective is on what that means. Oh my gosh, so many non-shrinking violets in here. I can't believe nobody's going to take a shot at this. I'm going to put somebody on the spot. Okay.
We heard it yesterday. Voice, understanding. Okay, somebody help me out. Respect, yes. Respect. And neutrality.
Excellent. Right.
Coffee.
Lots of coffee in there. Yeah, there's lots of coffee. Right. That's basically the idea, right? Is that nobody expects that every person who comes through a court proceeding is going to feel great about it. There are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. But the key piece is that if you're a loser, you want to feel like the process was fair. And that's really critical. And for the most part, people say that we do that well. When you talk to people who have had experiences directly with courts, they say, yeah, I felt like all those things, right? Like that I was heard, that I was recognized, and so that's a positive, and we need to keep doing those things well. One thing that I'll mention as we talk through all of these, both pros and cons, is that in my work, I'm really putting a big focus on what I would describe as the things that we can control. And so you can go to lots of sessions on public trust and confidence, and hear about all the things that are outside of our control. And so you can hear about the influence of social media and misinformation, and the role of the U.S. Supreme Court and what ends up on the front pages of the paper, or leads the local news, and all of those things have an impact. There's no question about that. But those things are, for the most part, outside of our control. And so I think it's kind of imperative on us to think about the things that rather than just throwing our hands up and saying, well, all these pervasive influences are outside of our control, so what can we do? I think it's better for us to think about the things that we can have an impact on and think about those things and then try to make improvements in those areas. So these are all what I would describe as like positive things that we have some control over. And as we get to the challenges, I also believe for the most part, we have control over those things. So my philosophy on this is that we need to focus on the things that we can make an impact on, rather than simply bemoaning all of the things that we can't. So let's get into a little more detail, and I'll show you some of the data on these points. In our surveys, we ask people how much confidence they have in a variety of different institutions, and I'm not getting down to the nitty-gritty of the exact wording. These are summaries, but I think they're fair and accurate summaries of the sorts of questions that we ask. And you can see in our data for the last number of years, and I could add some additional, more recent data, but it's pretty consistent with what you see here. You look at all these numbers and you can see that courts come out on top relative to the other two branches of government. And the number ranges, right? I mean, in 2018, you can see that it was a split of 16% between the courts and the executive. It's a little closer now, but the point is to look at the trend and to see that consistently over time, people say they have more trust in the courts than they do in the other branches. So I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I mean, presumably, we're really proud of this, and this is the way that it's been for years and years and years, and presumably this is the way it's been forever. But I was wrong, because when I look back, things were a little bit different 25 years ago, right? So we haven't always been the most trusted branch of government, and that should make us realize that, that's not something we own just because perspectives change over time. So the 99 survey is revealing, and that those are probably all within what the pollster would describe as a margin of error, but basically it means we were all on the same plane at that point. And then I went back and looked at the first survey that we have from 1977, and take a look at that. In 1977, we were the least trusted branch of government. And I don't know why. I don't know what was happening in the mid-1970s that might have presented this kind of result. I welcome any hypotheses from anybody who was active in civic life in the 70s. I was not. I was a toddler, so I can't really hypothesize other than the history. But the point is, where we are today, we probably should cherish that, and we should think about ways that we can keep us in that position, because it hasn't always been quite like that. So I thought that was a very interesting finding to look back all that time and realize that it was quite a different take people had 50 years ago. All right, moving on to the second key finding. We ask people whether they agree or disagree that state courts are committed to protecting individual rights. And these data points from the last 10 or so years show that there's a bit of a range here, but for the most part, the numbers are pretty good. In some cases, more than 2 out of 3 people saying that courts do this very well. And that's obviously a positive, that people feel that way, that they see that we are kind of executing on that constitutional obligation to uphold people's individual rights. And it's also fairly consistent with a question that I found from the survey 25 years ago. Now this is different survey, different language, and slightly different framework, because in the 1999 survey, they were asking about kind of in the criminal context only, right? Do courts protect defendants' constitutional rights? But that number was very high. And so again, going back a little bit, you can see that there's a fair amount of consistency. The numbers have softened a little bit, but again, that might just be a difference in the wording of the questions that produces that over the 25 years. So again, that's a second fairly positive takeaway. This one, I think, probably is going to engender a little bit of discussion because it's a positive for us, but it's a positive for us provided that we continue to meet people where they are and where they're going. And we actually first asked this question in 2014. We asked our respondents that if you had business with the courts and this service was available online via video conferencing, would you use it? Which is a mouthful, right? Video conferencing was the language we used in 2014 before there was Zoom or anything like that. So we called it video conferencing. And 10 years ago, people were like, probably not, right? More people saying that they would not than people saying that they would. It wasn't really quite a reality in people's lives outside of, we weren't doing things like filing your taxes on a computer in 2014. So there was some skepticism about the idea when it was first introduced in our survey. The number went way up in 2020, and I'm not including that in the slide because I consider it an outlier because we asked this question in the middle of the pandemic and, people weren't going anywhere. And so people were like, yeah, well, of course I would do that, but it's because I really don't have a choice. But we asked it the next year in 2021, and that number came down from 2020, but it still was up considerably over 2014 as the comfort level with doing more business online grows. And in 2022, we saw that number go up even further to nearly 6 out of 10 people saying that they would. And one thing I want to make clear about this question, I'm not sure that the question phraseology quite captures it. In this question, we're asking people about their own case. If you had a case, this is not an abstract, what do you think about the idea of courts doing this or that? This is, if you had an issue that you needed to resolve in your life and you were a litigant, would you be willing to do this thing remotely by video? So now we're up to close to 60% in 2022. And one thing that we saw in 2022 was an interesting demographic gap, which is to say, younger people were more likely to say that they would do it than older people. Makes some sense, right? Based on people's comfort level with technology, and kids under 50 kids, they're more likely to be early adopters, obviously. In the last couple of years, we have noticed that this demographic split in this kind of question has gone away. And that's not because younger people are less likely to say that they're okay with this. It's because older people are more likely to, in other words, that gap, that age gap that we saw a couple of years ago has basically closed. It's gone. Everybody, regardless of your age, is now getting comfortable with this idea. So I put this into the positive category insofar as the courts were able to use this sort of technology through the pandemic. We were able to adopt and keep some pieces of that post-pandemic. But the point that I would make on this is that it's an expectation. We're moving into a world where this is an expectation because people are able to do so much of the things they need to do in their lives on their phones, on their computers, without the disruption of doing things in person. And I think that presents us with a challenge as a community. And I see Roger has his hand up. I want to invite him to, thank you, Erica. Roger's got a question. I think this presents us with a challenge because just as surely as this could be a positive for us today, if we don't meet it, it could become a negative for us in the not too distant future. Roger, you've got the mic.
Was this question asked multiple times with different case types so that you're shaking your head no. So in the future, it would be interesting to see if, when faced with their civil liberties getting taken away, if that number would go down for video conferencing versus not. So we have in our court, we offer, majority of our municipal courts are all virtual now. And even if you show up to court, you're going to be put down in front of a computer with a set of headphones and go into a virtual court because the judge isn't in the courtroom. The clerk may be in the courtroom, but the judge is probably in their chambers. And then first appearance is different too. So even on those cases where civil liberties are being taken away, we do offer remote appearances on that first appearance because oftentimes they're released from custody the night before at 2 a.m. And we have a lower FTA rate if you allow those people to have that first appearance when they're getting their attorney to appear, via WebEx. But so I'd just be interested to see what was happening across the country.
So you raise, I think, what is a critical point and a critical question, which I do think that the case type is going to matter. And I think we need to collect more information, not necessarily through public opinion surveys about this, but through empirical research, identifying those sorts of things. How do you use this technology to lower your FTA rate? What produces better outcomes? And I know from research that we did in the mid-2010s using these same instruments, we asked people about online dispute resolution, right? Not video conferencing, but about ODR. Everybody remember ODR? It was a thing for like 5 years, and maybe it still is. I'm not sure. But we did gather some interesting information from that, and you will not be surprised to know that things like family cases and criminal cases, people were a lot less enthusiastic about ODR than they were about, handling a traffic matter or something fairly routine and fairly simple. So I would guess that would probably track too, because I think that there's some. I don't have the data on this, but my intuition would say, the more serious the matter, the more likely you probably do expect to to have that happen in person. So anybody else have any reactions or questions on what Roger raised or anything else? Because I think this is an important one for us to think about.
Did you ask this question of lawyers?
Of lawyers?
Yes.
No, but I could tell you the answer on that one.
Well, I mean, we talk to lawyers in states all over the country. Public defenders say their clients love it.
Yeah.
Lawyers that work with folks in domestic or family cases and juvenile cases love it.
Yeah.
And especially for short cause matters or in mediation, it has really lowered the temperature level of what happens in the same room, although it sometimes creates problems because they ditch the thing in the middle.
Yeah.
But lawyers generally say their clients really like it. Lawyers don't necessarily like it because they turn into tech assistants to get their clients ready for these video conferences, and they have to give them guidance about what the judges are expecting. And they said we basically become 75% of our time is doing technical assistance. Any
other reactions on that? I certainly think from my own experience in presenting this kind of information to bar associations, they're generally they're down on remote, just generally, right? I mean, I think there probably are business reasons for that. But the lawyers are only one part of the customers we're serving here. Back to Roger. Thank you, Erica.
When we talk about the various parties and people coming into the courthouse, one area that we have kept remote, which I'm proud of, is we do remote grand jury selection. So that, as troubling as it is, because it takes multiple clerks and training staff to be present during the grand jury selection, it keeps us in practice. So if we were to have to do something again through a pandemic or something that was beyond our control, we would be better poised to switch over to that remote type of a hearing. nobody wants to do jury trials
Right.
remote. It's a disaster.
Right.
You know, it's very difficult managing the jury, and you know, you just aren't keeping their focus. But if you have to, you know, it's good to have the practice.
Yeah. I think that, Howard, go ahead.
Just to emphasize, I'm retired now, but I was in the jury area a long time and did it. I'm just going to challenge you a little bit. The initial stages of pettit jury, you know, when you had to bring all the cattle call in and all those folks, you can do a lot of your initial stages. And I think the public does like that. You know, the ones that are just almost obvious they're going to be excused. So I think if you're able to find where that sweet spot is, I concur. But I don't think we want to dismiss that there's a huge part in the pettit selection too, both criminal and civil. And I know we're still, you need to continue to try to, and the public loves that. And the other aspect that I think that from a security perspective, think about all those folks that are coming through your courthouses that need to get screened, and just for the sake that they're coming in just to be excused within an hour. So I just don't want to dismiss that there is a sweet spot that it should stay with pettit also.
Yeah, the sweet spot is an interesting thing to drill down on to figure out where that is. I mean, I this afternoon, if you hang around for the 3:00 session, you're going to hear me and the pollster talk a bit about what we learned through some focus groups that we did. But one of the things that we heard loud and clear is that people loved virtual voir dire, right? This to me, I would get me off on a tirade about how jury selection is being run. I think we're doing great damage to people's public trust. For people who come to a courthouse and have an experience that is a negative one, for the 10% who go and sit on a jury, you know, rahat, they love it. It's a great experience for them. The 90% of people who got summoned and spent time, money, and all those things they feel like were wasted and then were sent away, maybe with an explanation, maybe without. You know, I mean, would you spend $9 to make $1? That's kind of, I think, the position that we're in at the moment. So I would like to see us figure out how to do more of the jury selection pieces online, because I think it's good for customer service and public trust, but recognizing there's a lot of nuance in how this works and there's a lot of interested parties. Anything else on this remote thing? Otherwise, we're going to charge ahead, and we're still on the good news side of things. We're about to get into some more of the depressing snowstorm content shortly. So, all right, last piece of good news here: procedural fairness. We talked about this at the outset. We haven't asked this question for a couple of years, but when we were asking it regularly in the mid 2010s, we saw very consistent numbers, and you can see that there is a little bit of a range. Between 70% in 2015, a high mark of 78% in 2016, everything kind of in there. But when you can get more than 7 out of 10 people to agree on something, that tends to tell you you're doing something right and that people are seeing it right. And this is a question that we only asked of people who told us that they'd had an experience. Because when you do a survey, one of the things you can do is you can ask people to give you the demographic information, and then what have you done, you know, yourself in a court, and so you can sort of create this sort of what they call a crosstab set where you can filter by people's experiences. When we aggregate all the people who told us that they had an experience directly with the court and ask them this question, the number is very, very good. So we actually stopped asking this question because we felt like we knew what we needed to know, and it was taking up place on the survey. And it was like, well, every year we're seeing this between 70 and 75. We must be doing something right. So we're going to set that question aside and replace it with other questions to get different information. Maybe time to go back and ask it again, but certainly over this period of time, people were very positive about their impressions of procedural fairness. Okay, let's move on to the second portion of this, which is the challenges. And you know, this list is long, and it can feel daunting at times, and it can feel like there are things that maybe are out of our control on this list. I think that there are probably in all these areas things that we can and should be looking at doing differently or better to help us out. And when I went through all of the findings, I was able to categorize them into two big buckets, right? And so you're going to see this in a second. We've got a bucket which I'm calling access issues, and then a second bucket that I'm calling fairness issues, access and fairness. And so, what do I really mean by that? Well, access is, can you get into the system to get the thing that you're seeking, the justice that you're seeking? And then fairness is, okay, once you're in there, what's the process like? Does it feel fair to you? And that's how I grouped these findings. So the access findings, courts are perceived as being expensive and complicated. They are not perceived as being customer service oriented, and we are perceived as lagging in customer-facing technology. On the fairness side, judges and to an extent courts are seen as political actors. Most people tell us they feel like there are two systems of justice, and so the fairness you get depends on factors outside of your control, and concerns about racial bias abound. Those are not new. They are consistent findings. They have been consistent findings for 50 years, as you're going to see. But they're also not really changing for the better. So those are my two categories. We'll go through these in a little more detail. We did some focus groups about 10 years ago. We did them in conjunction with the American Bar Association. The ABA was interested in working with our pollster to better understand how to support civil legal services. And this is one of the quotes from the report that the pollster prepared. We sat with folks, these focus groups I think were done in, if I recall, Atlanta. Respondents consistently expressed a belief that the entire legal system is designed to benefit itself rather than the people it serves. That's a pretty harrowing statement. I sat through those focus groups. I would agree with that takeaway. We did focus groups in 2023 and we heard more of the same, right? So that is kind of a shot across the bow. So how do we measure this in our data? Well, one way to do that is to ask people whether they think they could handle a matter themselves without an attorney to help them through the process. And in 1999, they asked this question 25 years ago, and a majority of people said, yeah, I could probably do that if I had to do that. 58% said they thought they could represent themselves in a court proceeding. 19 years later, that number is down to just over 1 in 3, meaning 2 out of 3 people feel like they could not do that, which is underpinned in this perception that the system is slow and expensive and complicated. That perception is sort of furthered by a sense that that courts aren't built to be customer service focused. And you can see this over the last number of years, the percentage of our respondents saying that they thought that courts provide good customer service. Those words are in quotes because that was the actual wording they saw. Does that describe courts well or very well? And you can see that the high watermark was 54%. But more recently, our numbers are looking more like 41%. And so that's not a majority. We pulled out the very well portion there. Those are people who feel strongly about something. That's kind of a measure of intensity inside the question. And so only 9% feel like courts provide good customer service. That's a description that describes the courts very well. So concerns here, that's how you kind of measure this. Yes, sir. We'll wait for the mic for the, yeah, it is. Out of courtesy to those folks, we'll wait for the mic. Even though you could yell and everybody could hear you.
So how big is the sample? And did you have a narrower sample which just looked at people who had experiences in court litigants?
Yes. The sample is on these surveys is always 1,000 people at a national level, which gives you a margin of error of 3 percentage points. So it's a big sample for a national survey. And so one of the more troubling takeaways to the second part of your question is the people who had experience, who told us that they had experience, their views were dimmer than the people who were just thinking about this in the abstract, right? So your real world experience ain't helpful. It's a tough one. I think one of the things that this survey data has helped us understand is that there is a lot of conventional wisdom about how we think about the work that we do. And again, this will get elaborated upon this afternoon. It turns out that a lot of the conventional wisdom that we've held isn't really supported by at least a lot of these findings. Jenny.
This prompts me to share two observations. One is I had need to have a civil lawsuit, and although I knew exactly what happens, I hired a lawyer because I acknowledged I'm scared to go it alone.
Yep.
The other perception is I'm now retired from the courts, and unfortunately, the longer I am away, the less I trust what I hear about government. That's awful. As a public sector employee, when I was in it, I trusted. So what does that say to me? Am I taking information in from all the media and the social media and the average layperson? I don't know. These findings are very troubling.
Your first observation about the fact that you, as somebody who understands the system, but you still felt like you needed to hire a lawyer, I mean, that's in my own life. I've done it both ways, where I've had to hire a lawyer, and I went through one process that I did myself, mostly for fun. I mean, I wouldn't say fun, but I wanted to have that experience. I wanted to see what this was like to do it yourself, even though I do have the means to hire a lawyer, and I've done it in other instances. I once tried it myself. It was not pretty, and the outcome I got by hiring a lawyer in a different situation was different, I think, than I would have got if I had not.
And then I have just another follow-up. On some of the timing for these results, I'm trying to think, okay, what were the milestone events happening in courts? Self-help centers in one of these timeframes, back to your early findings. Courts were not taking control of the caseload, like the 1977 data.
Right.
There was no perception that the courts are paying attention. I'm trying to think, okay, over the history, what are the key mileposts?
Right.
That we have led
Right.
in those eras.
As a profession, right? I think we should think about that. I wanted to, the lagging in technology and innovation point, I wanted to go back to this is the 1977 survey. That brick up there is the big book that I found in our library. It's like 300 pages. It's like a PhD thesis. So that's the picture of what it looks like. And in 1977, 62%, when asked this question, said that the efficiency in the courts is a serious or very serious problem. So we're going way back, not a new issue. Kind of to your point. This is the data that underlies that. That's impossible to read on a screen that's this size, and that the font size is too small. There it is. It's a little bit easier to read there. This is the 1977 survey. And where's there we go. Okay, so to the question about people who have had experience, right? That number 35, people who've had experience, 24. So that finding goes back all the way to the 70s. People who have encountered the system have more concerns than people who have not. This is back on the remote hearings piece because I do think this is an opportunity for us on technology to make improvements and to kind of meet people where they are. And if there was, I'm sure that many of you have heard the expression that was I think delivered by the Chief Justice of Michigan during the pandemic. She said that the pandemic wasn't it wasn't the crisis that the courts wanted, but it was the crisis the courts needed because it forced leapfrogging innovations in technology. And so in 2021, we asked our respondents what they thought about the future, right? And should courts continue to do hearings remotely, or should they go back? And so in a question like this, what you're doing is you're taking the best arguments on both sides of the issue, and you put them in front of people, and then they're forced to make a choice. And so neither of these, there might be a lot of gray area for people on this, but they were kind of forced to say, if you had to pick one or the other, which way would you go? And you can see that that a majority, it's not a sizable majority, but a majority of people said that courts should continue to hold hearings by video after the pandemic because it's good customer service and it's easier for participants. And you can see this second chart shows that intensity is stronger the younger that you are. Again, not a surprising finding. Going back to those focus groups, when people were asked about encountering court websites, one respondent gave this, I thought, hilarious quote. It seems to be by design that they have no design, which is an indictment if ever I've heard one. And I don't know how much control you all have over your websites. I know a lot of state courts have done a great job of improving their sites in the last number of years. I think this is still a really easy win if you can find a cheap and effective way to improve your website, so that this sort of cynicism will be lowered. Okay, those are my access issues: the technology, the customer service. Before we go on to the fairness pieces of this, are there any other questions or comments on kind of those issues? If not, then we'll carry on. Okay. This, I think, is the harder stuff because it does feel maybe a little more out of our control, certainly as court managers. We start to get into the pieces of this that are more driven by external forces or factors, but that affect how people see the work that we all do. Judges are seen as political. Is anybody surprised by that? Is there a person in this room who would say, wow, what a shock, people think that judges are political? I would love to see a hand raised if there is somebody who wants to argue that side, because I think there are good arguments for it. No takers? Right, judges are seen as political, whether we like it or not.
Does that vary by state? Elected versus...
Such an interesting question. I haven't seen any empirical research that says one way or another that an elected judge is seen as more political than an appointed judge. People see politics on all sides of this, right? And they see the naked partisan politics of an election campaign, and then they see judges who are appointed to the bench because they came out of the governor's office, or the system is built in such a way that there isn't a process for review. It's just straight up. And some of them, unfortunately, whether or not the person is qualified often gets lost in the process. And so on the one hand, you might think, well, obviously in states where judges run for election, they're going to be seen as more political. I'm not sure that's true. And the other piece I'll tell you about this is that, well, many of us, maybe most of us, might be aghast by what judicial elections look like and how they operate. A lot of people see that as a mechanism of accountability. It gives them a say, right? And they don't have a say when the governor or the legislature are making those choices, so they don't hate it. And that's why no state has moved away from judicial elections in 30 years, right? Because people fundamentally will trust themselves before they will trust the political branches of government to make those choices. And you can think what you want about that, and you can say, that's nice, but you know, you don't know anything about these people. But there are reasons that no state has moved away from judicial elections where they exist for so long, right? And that's because of popular will and how people see accountability working. Great question, though. I would love to get an answer to that. We can't even look in our data here and look at the states where there are like state Supreme Court elections because the sample size gets too small. So I can't answer that with any authority, but it's a fascinating question to me, and I'd like to see more research on that. Roger.
I find this to be an interesting question, and I think that there could be additional data points collected along this because, you know, in some states, I think that there are clearly political judges because they're partisan running for office, like in Virginia. I mean, if you can run as a Republican or Democrat or independent, which shocks me when I found that out.
We don't do that in Virginia.
Oh, not in Virginia.
No.
Okay.
North Carolina, yes. But,
North Carolina,
but not Virginia.
okay.
Yeah. I live in Virginia, so.
Okay, thank you. One interesting thought I had was, you know, judges can be seen as culturally different. In courts where there's this urban-rural divide, there's a feeling, I think, by the public that if you have a certain type of case and your case is heard in a rural court versus an urban court, you may be treated differently. And I see that in reading things about family or domestic violence cases and where women may be treated differently in a one environment than the other. And I think that sometimes from the outside, when people are reading media, they're seeing this as political, when in fact it could be partly cultural, that sometimes decisions are made not based on politics, but by the community in which these judges are elected. So there's like a community thought or a cultural thought that sort of goes around, you know, things that are happening and how they are perceiving being treated as actually they're being treated as a member of that community, which is different from the community where they came from. So if you were an urban person facing a charge in a rural court, you may perceive that as political, where actually it might be cultural.
That's so interesting. Do you think any of that has to do simply, do you think it is that rural urban thing, or is it simply a change of venue, right? I mean, I know where I live, for instance, I would only hire a lawyer who practices at one of the law firms across the street. And if I went 60 miles up the road to Richmond, Virginia, and I had a case there, I would do the same thing. I'd look for a lawyer who's practicing right there. I wouldn't bring my Williamsburg lawyer up, no way. Because 60 miles apart, they may as well be two different, like you're on different moons almost, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
I'm sorry that this is really hard to read. I don't know what to do about this 1970s type. I guess I got to get it reworked. But this is an extension of that same judges are seen as political. Look at this question. Court decisions are influenced by political considerations. I think that maybe this is where there's a dividing line, because I think we would all probably agree that judges are political, but that doesn't mean that their decisions are political. And I think that's where a lot of us would say, there's a split there, but that's not always the way that people see it. And let me see if I've got the detail here, right? So this is a question from the 70s, perceived seriousness and frequency of problems related to equality and fairness. And 26% court decisions that are influenced by political considerations. This is, I think, like a pick one or two type of thing. And as you can see, it's near the top of the list relative to some of the other options. So it is not a new challenge for us. It goes way back. And I think it gets more troubling when people actually think that the actual decisions in the courtroom are influenced by politics. Move forward into the late 90s, 81% agree with the statement that judges' decisions are influenced by political considerations. I'm going to move past those because they're so hard to read. And then we get more current, and the questions that we have asked try to make this split in how people see things, right? And so we ask two different questions. One is based on, is there politics involved in how judges get chosen? That's the one on the left. And then the second question is, are decisions made based on politics, political pressure, personal beliefs, or a review of the facts and law? And you can see that there is a difference here. The difference is somewhat minor, but you can see that at least when we asked this question in 2017, that a majority of people believed that connections and political influence were more important than qualifications and experience. But those same people told us that inside the courtroom, judges make decisions based more on the facts and the law than on their own personal viewpoints. So all of which is to say, I'm trying to present the ancient history here, the relatively recent history here, and then bringing us up the last couple of years. There is a difference. We haven't asked these questions recently, and I think it's time for us to go back and look at this again and refresh to see how people feel. But you can see that split, which I think comes out the way that we want it to. Roger, you've got the mic again.
I just, as we're looking at these survey results over time from the 70s to the present, was demographic information being taken in the 70s?
It was, yeah.
It was. So do we see that there's a different demographic answering the questions from those results in the 70s to the present? I'm just wondering if that perception, I noticed that the one question in the 70s was, do Blacks feel that they're being treated fairly? And I'm just like, well, how many Black people filled out the survey?
Yeah, so
answers.
people did self-identify in those surveys as well. I mean, in all these surveys, it's a self-identification question that is asked, right? It's not an observational question. It's a self-identification question. I would have to go back and look, but I believe that the 70s survey followed like top flight methodology for the 70s, which is just like our polls today. They're designed to capture an accurate national demographic, right? So you can weight and you can balance. If you're undercounting because you can't get enough responses for one particular demographic group, they can use weighting to do that. If they prefer not to do that, if they don't have to. But I think I feel safe in saying that the 70s work was like very solid for 1977 and reflective of national demographics in 1977. Okay, we are working our way through this, all this bad news. This one, I think, is for me maybe the one that is closest to heartbreaking. And you're going to hear more about this again this afternoon. Two systems of justice. This is, I think, maybe the way that best captures most people's greatest concerns about the system of justice that we have in this country right now. This is the 1 year in this survey that we asked these specific questions, but I can tell you based on the more recent research that we've done, it's just as bad or perhaps worse than it was 10 years ago when we asked this question. Tell me whether you believe this particular group is treated better or worse by the courts or justice system. And we used both court and justice system. We do a thing called a split sample, where half the sample has the word court and half the sample has the word justice. Because when you start talking about this sort of thing, people will often confuse or conflate or mix up law enforcement and the justice system writ large with the courts themselves. So we wanted to see, could we control for that? And does that word make a difference in how people see things? And it turned out it didn't make a difference. The numbers were the same. But the bottom line is that most people see the wealthy and large corporations as getting preferential treatment. And they see those groups, African Americans, divorced fathers, and the poor, as getting worse treatment from the system. How do we see this in our polling data over a trend? Well, one way to look at this is to ask people whether or not they feel like courts are providing equal justice to all. This is kind of what I call the baseline question in our work. Once you move beyond the question of do people have public trust and confidence, The next question is, as you get more detailed, how well are we doing with providing equal justice to all? That is, in my view, job one. That's what we're here to do. You put it over the building. There's a reason for that, equal justice for all. And unfortunately, this is how the numbers have played out over the last 10 years. The blue line represents a majority of people for most of the last 10 years telling us that we are doing well on this, reasonably well. Not great, but reasonably well. The orange line represents people telling us that we're not doing well. And look what has happened. That gap has completely closed. And we're now what I describe as underwater on this question, with more people saying that we don't do this well than saying that we do this well. That 2022 number, 49% saying not, 43% saying yes. It's gotten a little bit better in the last year or two, but the most recent survey, it was 47-47. We're not seeing a big change, but what we are seeing is, over the last 10 years, people feeling like this is somewhat slipping away from them. The idea that everybody will be treated equally. Depressed yet? Yeah, sorry. Yes, sir.
Not sure what was happening in 2014, that it seemed somewhat anomalous, but if you were to flatline this as a trend from 2012 to 2018, it'd be pretty close to a flat line on both the doing well and not doing well. What do you think happened in 2018 that things started going downhill on to doing very well? In other words, are you able to tease out,
Causation.
you ask secondary questions about why do you think this is happening?
I don't know, right? I wish I knew, because then I'd be like, here's what we needed to do differently. I don't have, part of the problem with polling is it doesn't really give you causation. It can give you some correlation, but it can't really tell you the why. So I don't know. I don't know what was happening, and we can speculate about this. There could be lots of possible reasons for why this has become, why this has started to move in the wrong direction, but I don't know. I wish I did. Yeah, and that could certainly be part of it, right? But I think the trend line is such that it's pretty hard to deny that we're on the wrong side of this question, right? Even if we got back up to the mid-50s, this is one of those questions that we should be getting 80% on. Almost everybody should feel like there's equal justice for all. Again, job one, right? So really good question, and I wish I'd be glad to stand up here for half an hour more and speculate. Then we could probably do that as a group, but I'll spare you that. Any other questions? While I'm paused here, we're going to move on to the last piece of this, which I think is also very troubling and consistent with a lot of findings for a long, long time. There is a really big gulf between how I'll describe them as white and non-white, to keep it as simple as I can. How people, white and non-white people, see the system working. And this is from our 2022 survey. On that question, the equal justice question, you can see where I think we were at 42-49 overall. When you ask white respondents, it's 46-46. When you ask Hispanic or Latino respondents, 38-59. Black, 30-61. And so this is, these are hard numbers to look away from. They're hard numbers to look at, but they're hard numbers to look away from because they are so stark. Because there is such a big difference in people's experiences and their perspectives and how they see the system working. And none of us, I think, want to be happy about a situation where people feel like the justice they get depends on, frankly, the color of their skin, right? We don't want that. Going back to that 2015 survey that I was citing a few minutes ago, this is a little more dense, but I'm pulling it up here. You can read it. I principally want you to look at the differences, okay? So the red blocks are the overall sample. So that's not just white and non-white. The overall sample is everybody. And then when you pull out just the people who self-identified as African Americans, those are the blue numbers. And you can see these gaps across this spectrum of key questions about how people feel about the system. And you can see how big those gaps are. And the bottom right number, the provide equal justice to all, that's a 25% difference, which is, shocking. It was shocking in 2015, and I don't think it's moved a whole lot since then. All right, that is the end of my slide deck. And it's a lot of, everybody remember the positive pieces? Right. So where does that leave us, I guess, is a good place to wrap this up. I think it leaves us in a difficult spot. And I hope that looking at this information has given you some things to think about in terms of the realities that happen, inside your courthouses every day, things that we might be able to look at doing differently to sort of try to own some of the issues that we can own, recognize those things that we can't change, but also have the power to try to improve things that we can change. And I think I'll conclude there and see if there are any other questions or comments before we wrap up, because I think we have a couple of minutes before the break. Give the microphone back to Janet. Thanks, Erica.
Jesse, I'm curious about where you have funneled, published, shared these results outside the court family. I assume you have planted articles. I assume you mentioned you presented to bar associations. Yeah. So I'm curious about the different audiences that have heard this information and the reactions that you might have gotten from them.
That's a great question. So court managers, obviously, we've had this information in front of NACM for a number of years. Judicial conferences, absolutely. I do a lot of this virtually, or occasionally we'll go to a judicial conference and present this information. Bar associations, for sure. Yes, we try to publish articles. I've got an article that looks at and feels a lot like this in the new AJA journal that just came out, Court Review, I think it's called. Sort of same idea, but more of a narrative approach. Doing my best to sort of share it out there and to help help people understand some of the underlying dynamics that are in play. The reactions vary. As you might be not surprised to know, people aren't really enthusiastic about hearing bad news or being told that the system isn't perfect or that they're part of a problem. But I think that at the same time, there's a recognition. People, whether you're a judge, an attorney, a court manager, people recognize that this is not fantasy because it is playing out in their daily lives. And then we get into the how willing are people or groups, how willing are they to engage in change, to try to improve these sorts of things. And I think that, all of you as court managers, what you do every day is change. You adapt to change, you implement change. Change management is a huge part of the work of a court manager. I'm not sure that same thing is true for the other two major groups that I've identified, where there's a little more change resistance. And I thought the question about like remote appearances and attorneys and how they feel about that, I think that's a good example of there's some intransigence to kind of going to where people are because of the potential impact it might have on lines of business and that sort of thing. So that's a bit about how we've tried to share it. This is all public. This is all on our website. This is all shareable. If you think it's useful to share it widely, please do. We would love that. The reason that we do this is so that we have like the mirror in front of us and be like, okay, I don't really like how I look this morning. What am I going to do today to change that? Greg.
I think, especially when you're talking about opinion on, politics in decisions and whatnot, it'd be nice to separate out the effect of federal politics and federal courts, because honestly, within a state, there may be a couple of noteworthy news items about courts or a particular case, but quite honestly, it's not that big a deal. But you can't avoid some of the very political cases that have come federally in the last year, and I think that's got to be bleeding over into what you're getting here. If we're not, we got to tease it out, I think.
There's no question that it's bleeding over, no question. And again, I'll give you a little preview of some of what we'll talk about this afternoon. For those of you who might not be able to hang around, I hope you'll pick up we have a paper copy of a guidebook that we've released called Beyond Civics Education. And it is designed to help all of us think through new strategies so that we can improve our public trust. The first step in that strategy is to do exactly what you're describing, which is to highlight the work of state courts. We don't do a great job of doing that. The federal courts, the Supreme Court, have the megaphone. When you talk to people about where justice happens in America, when you tell them that 95% of the cases happen in state courts, happen in that building on your street, that these are things that justice is administered by your friends and neighbors in your local community. When you highlight those things, most people don't really A, know that, or really B, think about it. And when you tell them that, light bulbs go on. And all of a sudden, state and local courts get perceived more as a local community institution. And everything that we know about public trust in institutions is the more local something is, the more trust that people have in it. So we need to push that message. We need to tell people about the work that we do, where it happens, who does it. And that's, I think, a very valid point.
Have you done any comparative analyses with other British common law countries, like who might take surveys like this, like the UK or Australia, to see if they face sort of the same kind of institutional entrenchment that we experience in the US? I mean, you could probably look at CEPED in the European Union also, but those mostly are civil law jurisdictions. And the other comparative analysis, which would be interesting, is in the real estate or banking or educational systems, the perceptions of, when we look specifically at issues around bias, racial and ethnic disparities and that type of thing. Have you done those kinds of comparative analyses?
I haven't done them myself, but there is an incredible publicly available tool called the Edelman Public Trust Barometer that does exactly what you're describing. You can Google it, public website, they put all their data out there. They do, I'm not sure how many countries they do survey work in. And the long story short is that this is a global challenge. Institutions around the world, in all the countries around the world, support in institutions, faith in institutions is on the decline across all of the institutions, all the ones that you've mentioned, everyone, pretty much everyone you can mention. The one interesting outlier to that appears to be corporations and business, where trust is holding steady, which is kind of fascinating, at least in the most recent survey. So Edelman Public Trust Barometer, if you look that up, it's a great resource. Any other questions, comments, or insults before we wrap up? I think that's the takeaway, yeah. Yeah. Right. Don't wave the white flag, right? What we do is too important to wave the white flag and say we can't do it, or the headwinds are too strong. And you can wake up every morning and if you're like me, you open your, I don't read newspapers in print anymore. I open the apps on my phone. I'm like, oh man. But The work that we do is too important to just capitulate. Thanks, Howard. Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Thank you much for your attention, for your engagement. I really appreciate it. It's been a great, very interesting session. And we're doing the 3 o'clock session with our pollster this afternoon if you can hang around. If you can't, please look at the resource materials that are in the app or pick up a paper copy of the guidebook because it's designed to give you some to-dos. All right?
And
Thank
please
you.
don't forget to rate your presenter and the presentation today. Thank you so much for your service.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Erica.